Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Aisha Subarkash. Iran's relations with the West are once again strained after Tehran disconnected a number of cameras installed by the UN watchdog to monitor its nuclear activity. Reports suggest it is in response to a censure by Western powers for Iran's lack of cooperation. The International Atomic Energy Agency has raised concerns over traces of enriched uranium previously found at 3 undeclared sites and has urged Iran to resume talks immediately. Talks to revive the nuclear deal have remained deadlocked since March. Iran's economy is struggling mostly due to the U.S. pulling out of the 2015 deal that restored sanctions on Iran's oil and banking sectors. As nationwide protests continue over the country's dire economic situation, Iran's currency this week spiraled to its lowest value ever. And since the Ukraine conflict began, Iran's oil exports to China have also dropped due to Beijing favoring discounted Russian oil. So, is Iran seeing its position weakening in the region due to internal instability and external changes? And to discuss this further, I'm now joined by former Iranian diplomat Mehrdad Khonsari in London, and from Cambridge, Nader Hashemi, who is the director of the Center of Middle East Studies at the University of Denver. Gentlemen, welcome to Straight Talk. It's good to have you on the program. Mehrdad, what's the latest in Iran's nuclear deal, talks actually with the West, and why have diplomatic talks to revive this deal have stalled now?
Well, I think that it's been a source of huge disappointment that things have not progressed as originally anticipated. And though the prospects for reaching an agreement have become harder, and especially with the recent censure on the part of the board of directors of the IAEA and Iran's sort of tit-for-tat action for removing certain cameras and so on, I believe that there is still perhaps some life still left in the efforts that are being made in order to try and revive the agreement, as parties on all sides really would like to see some kind of agreement reached, even at this late stage.
Nader, would you agree? Are you that optimistic? And how has this latest move by Iran dealt a blow to the already fragile ties and added fuel to the deep-running mistrust between the two sides?
I'm very pessimistic. I think the Iran nuclear deal is now on life support. But I think the biggest blow to the prospects of a diplomatic resolution of this crisis has to be laid at the doorstep of the United States. Let's remember, there was an agreement in place.
Yes.
Iran upheld its side of the bargain, and the United States pulled out of the agreement. When Biden was running for president, he announced that he would come back into the agreement, but he dragged his feet. Right from the outset, you started hearing things from the United States that they didn't want the same agreement revived. They wanted a, quote, stronger and longer agreement. It took several months before the United States agreed to come to Vienna. So I think that's fundamentally why we're at this impasse. Now, I'm saying this not as a supporter. In fact, I'm a strong critic of the Islamic Republic of Iran. They also have dragged their feet. But if you want to understand why we're at this breaking point in terms of diplomacy, one has to reference the points that I just made about U.S. foreign policy toward Iran and toward its own withdrawal of the agreement in 2018 under Donald Trump.
So, Mehrdad, would you agree? I mean, is it the U.S. who has derailed this process? And who is likely to benefit from this situation if nuclear talks collapse for good?
Well, I think I can't disagree at all with what was said, in the sense that there is no question that this issue was ignited by the United States' decision to withdraw on Donald Trump's intransigent positions. The point is that reviving it, and Biden agreed originally to come back to the original agreement and work his way up from that. But the Iranians don't have very many cards in their hands, and they're afraid that if they accept the deal as it was in 2015 and then have to renegotiate for a longer and stronger, and they would have to give away the kind of cards that they hold in their hands at this time. And they've been reluctant to doing that. But at the same time, While I also agree that the agreement is on life support, but there is a huge incentive on the part of Iran to resolve this because it really needs to have access to the kind of funds that would be released once if an agreement is signed and if there is some sanctions relief, especially since the Americans don't really object to Iran selling as much oil as it can at this particular time.
So, Nader, some argue that with the Russian and Chinese support to Iran and the U.S.'s chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, the Iranian administration had some sort of a leverage to expand the list of concessions it wants from the U.S. during the negotiations process. Are they off the table now?
Look, what's on the table right now is trying to get back to the existing agreement, the key sticking point that is preventing a resolution of this agreement. I mean, everyone knows that, look, they've come to an agreement. What remains on the table is one key sticking point, and that is the designation by the United States of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, as a terrorist organization. Iran wants that the IRGC removed from that list. The United States refuses to do so. And so we have an impasse. Yes. And it's important to point out the reason why we're at this juncture point is because under Donald Trump, listening to people who wanted to kill diplomacy, in other words, Arab dictatorships in the Gulf and Israel and their supporters in Washington, D.C., they deliberately inserted this into the U.S.-Iran relationship, knowing that it would be very difficult to solve this issue, thus thwarting diplomacy and opening the path to war. And the sad thing is that this group of sort of warmongers have basically won the day, and it looks like we're headed to a complete disaster in terms of future stability in the Middle East. So and the prospects of war look very real.
So on top of that, Mehrdad, how has Russia's attack on Ukraine impacted the Iranian politics and economy?
Well, obviously, the Iranian hierarchy, the deep state in Iran, has been fully behind Russia, a position that is completely different to the general feeling on the part of the population, who have basically always been very suspicious and the sort of the utter historical experiences that the Iranian people have had with Russia, which are not very good. But the point is that it's the deep state, it's Ayatollah Khamenei and his cronies who called the shots, and they are fully supportive of Russia. At the same time, the administration of Raisi, because of the failure of Europe to have come to Iran's aid as expected, especially before even Raisi took office, since Donald Trump withdrew from the JCPOA, Iran has gradually distanced itself also from Europe and moved, as they say, towards the east. This is going to be a very difficult position for Iran because it will motivate the Europeans and the Americans to take into account other calculations, especially Russian dominance of the Iranian political scene and things like that, which alter their calculations for the region. So despite the fact that Iran will be competing with Russia, let's say, for the sale of oil, the fact is strategically they are becoming more dependent on them, and that is going to be a problem in its relations with the West.
So, Nader, why do you think Iran hasn't been able to seize Russia's weakening influence and growing isolation when it comes to energy markets and oil exports?
Because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the former assumptions and calculations that we had about oil on the global market have been completely upended. So Iran was selling a lot of oil to China, averting American sanctions. But now that Russia is under sanctions from the European Union and the United States, it can now sell oil at a much cheaper rate to China, thus displacing Iran from the advantage that it previously has. And so this just weakens Iran's overall economic situation and adds to the misery that it's currently facing at this moment.
So last month, Iran has seized 2 oil tankers belonging to Greece, Mehrdad. The incident took place in retaliation for Greece impounding an oil tanker in April. carrying an Iranian oil near its shore. What do you make of this? I mean, how could regional escalations, including this latest incidents in Persian Gulf, impact changing dynamics in the region? And are tensions likely to boil over into a conflict?
Well, I think that all parties are, like to play the game, walking on the edge without actually walking into a conflict. Nobody wants a conflict, but Iranians want to show that they are not weak and that they're strong, and that if somebody moves against them, that they can retaliate. And this is exactly what they did. To what extent was the seizure of the Iranian tanker part of an overall larger plan? No one knows, because it's clear that the Americans want Gulf oil to replace as much of Russia's missing oil from the European markets as much as possible. So they're not really opposed to Iran selling their oil, despite all the rhetoric that is going on. But obviously, tensions are there. Iran-Israel tensions have been increasing. These assassinations, tit-for-tat actions,
Yes.
actions which have been averted. These are all things that could potentially get out of hand. And Iran's asymmetric strategy of deterrence against Israel could lead to outcomes that no one envisions at this particular time.
Nader, what's your take on that? What do you make of this latest rising tensions between Israel and Turkey? Because Israel has just urged its citizens to leave Turkey immediately for a fear of imminent attack or kidnappings of Israelis by Iranians.
Right. So in the last 6 weeks, Israel has assassinated 6 Iranians, both scientists and senior military officials. So Iran is going to have to retaliate. If it doesn't, it will invite more attacks. And it's going to go after these soft targets. Innocent Israeli civilians, most likely in Turkey, are going to lose their lives because of this new Israeli policy of targeted assassinations of Iranian scientists and military officials. So this is a tragedy, and it just does not bode well for the future stability of the region. And I fear it portends that we're headed to a major confrontation between Iran and Israel that will drag the United States in and be catastrophic, not only for the people of Iran, but for the people in the Middle East, right across the Middle East. And it will drastically affect, global oil prices. So we're headed for very dark days.
All right, gentlemen, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it here. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk.